we're going to hear a bit from Charlie Leadbeater, who many of you will be familiar with, who is a very rare and very fantastic writer, thinker on innovation of all kinds, including in business, in government, in the third sector. His most recent book is on frugal innovation and the methods of innovation emerging, particularly in India and other parts of the world, of leaner innovation methods and often for more frugal products and services. He's also in some ways emblematic of this field where most of the thinkers are also doers and get their hands dirty in practice and learn from practice rather than just sitting in the ivory tower. And we asked him to take a long view on labs. I don't know if you'll go all the way back to Pythagoras, as I did, but how do the discussions we're having here today fit in with the much longer history of humanity really discovering new methods of discovery? And what can we learn from that long view? So, Charlie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So I am going to try and take a long view. I'm going to not go back to Pythagoras, but go back a bit and go forward a bit. But just to establish who I am talking to, who here is involved in a lab? So I would say, 2/3 of the audience. If you're not involved in a lab, are you involved in a hub? Is there anyone involved in a hub? There are a smattering of hubs. Is there anyone involved in a lub, which is a cross between a lab and a hub? No. Has anyone here recently knowingly done a nudge? There are a few nudges. Okay, so most of the audience hasn't done a nudge. Just turn to the person on your right and just nudge them. Nudge them. There you are, you've done a nudge. Okay, the next trendy word is pivot. Who here has read Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup? Quite a lot of people. So there's a whole kind of generation of people now you see in coffee shops kind of working at computers who are in effect saying, you cannot talk to me, I'm about to do a pivot. And they're about to kind of shift their business model. So again, just turn to your right and you will have done a pivot. Lab, nudge, pivot, hub. We can mix it all up together. So what's in a word? What's in this word lab? What is this? It's a phone. What is this? It's a phone but with snake on it. What is this? It's a phone, but this phone is, of course, a diary, an alarm clock, a camera, most importantly, a computer, a games console, but we still call it a phone. So when we use this word lab, we are kind of necessarily implicated in using a word which has a kind of historic meaning, but trying to adapt it to what we're trying to do. And inevitably, that's a little bit uncomfortable because, of course, when you say lab, people expect men and women in white coats. And so I do think that one of the things this movement should do is employ a load of theatre students to go and work in a space with a big glass wall, wearing white coats with test tubes. And then when people say, can we see the government innovation lab, you can take them to see these people working away and they'll feel satisfied. Because the truth is that when you go to most of these labs, there are people sitting at computers drinking coffee and probably complaining about the air conditioning. So what's in this word and how should we understand why it is that we think this word is important? So I'm just going to say something about where it's come from. I'm going to say something about where it might be headed. And I'm going to show you one incredibly confusing diagram. So the new always comes dressed as the old. That's one of the things that we should learn, that it never comes all freshly minted. It always comes slightly mixed up. And this is one of the sources of this idea, the lab. This is Robert Hooke. He looks a bit like kind of a cross between Kristen Bas and David Halpern, so sort of brilliant but a little bit scary. And here he is, this sort of emaciated figure. And actually, Robert Hooke worked just down the road. If you've got time, you go out of the thing, you turn right and then take the first left you get to Gresham Street. He worked at Gresham College. He had a house on Bishopsgate. And Hooke was the original experimenter. He was the first experimenter of what became the Royal Society. And if you read his diaries, it's full of things like, tried an experiment with gunpowder. Except he was an incredibly eclectic person. He had a kind of intellectual range even greater than Jeff Mulgan's. So he did experiments in elasticity, gravity. He helped redesign the City of London after the fire. And he had this, his life would be basically get up, have a really hearty breakfast with his household, do some experiments, and then he'd go to coffee shops, and then he'd go to dinner, and he'd do a lot of talking. And the kind of routine, the lifestyle and kind of routine that Hooke created literally just down the road has two ingredients, really. The first is this idea that David talked about a lot, which is labs as places to test theory. So you have hypotheses and then you test them. And the important bit that sometimes gets forgotten, and which Derek Miller importantly reminded us of, is to do good tests, you have to have some good theories, or at least theories that you can put into testable form. So it's not just a question of gathering data and just testing it. You have to have some imagination, some theoretical understanding that you're trying out. And so Hooke created spaces where you could do, in a controlled way, tests of theories. But they were also places where you could talk openly. And there was a great guy who worked alongside Hooke called William Spratt, who was like the Wired magazine of the sort of 16th and 17th century. And he just recorded what Hooke was doing. And he said the point about this is that knowledge has traditionally been a hierarchical relationship, and actually to advance science you need an egalitarian relationship where people shared ideas and people could speak their mind and things could be tested openly. So this combination of labs as places where you can have special conversations and you can do special things and test things goes together. So what's the future then of labs, your labs, the kind of labs that we have here? Well, I think you should take the testing bit and the data bit and all of that, you should take that much, much further. I think that it should be absolutely commonplace for everyone in this room to share their basic data, to create shared open databases and archives. I think you should have peer-reviewed publications. You should make it absolutely commonplace that your work is peer-reviewed by at least 2 other organizations, and you should have shared testing of theories that develop over time. That's how scientific communities develop. But I also think that you should be having more engaged, more creative conversations, so more creative talking, if you like, with more people in more settings. And I think if you combine, if you like, big data with big conversations, if that's one of the ways of thinking about the future, you need to take it increasingly out of controlled environments where actually we don't do, I think, that much work in this kind of movement, and into the real world, where you're testing in real time with real people what you're trying to do. The real world is complex, fluid, uncertain, dynamic. It's not like a traditional lab. And one of the innovations that this group should be responsible for, I suppose, is that shift in movement from the controlled lab to the real world lab. And crucially, I think, linking labs to social movements. Because the end of the process, when you get the idea that pops out at the end, needs to be taken up, remade, mobilized, resources attached to by social movements, I think. That's the ultimate kind of generative mechanism. And so if you want an agenda for your future, from me, it would be do more testing, do more talking, take it into the real world, and build movements around it. And design it so that you can generate those movements. Because Marc has now arrived. Marc Ventresca, one of Marc's great insights and one of the most important things that Marc talks about is how movements remake markets. That often the biggest changes in markets start with social movements, whether they're around fair trade, organic, environment, labor, you name it. actually what we need to be feeding are not just policy machines, but movements. And indeed, in a way, to take Christian's point, more and more we need to see the state as a kind of movement, or at least the people within the state as a kind of movement we want to mobilize. So it's this combination, I think, that's going to be critical to the future of what goes on with people here. So I promised you one incredibly confusing and simplistic diagram. So I'm very proud of this diagram because it does combine simplicity and confusion in equal measure. So this is its first outing, well, in this form, the first outing for this diagram, so please bear with me. But before I do, just let me just introduce you to this guy. Does anyone know who this guy is? So this guy is one of the most remarkable scientists of the 20th century, Sidney Brenner. And what Sidney Brenner did was, about 3 years after Watson and Crick discovered the double helix of DNA, Brenner set out to decode the entire genome of a living organism. So in other words, it was like someone watching the Wright brothers fly and saying, I'm going to build a jumbo jet. Because based on this very simple insight, I am going to work out how a 3D living organism is generated out of this DNA data. And he got together a small team, and this is where they started. They started in a hut in the car park of the Cavendish Physical Laboratory in Cambridge. They started in the kind of marginal spaces that a lot of people here will feel they are working in. And the key thing that Brenner did was to create a community around this project. Firstly, by choosing a project that was ambitious and difficult and couldn't be solved just by one person or one team, but also by, from the beginning, sharing information and sharing tools and sharing data amongst this community who are decoding the genome of the worm. Their key resource sharing information point was something called the Worm Breeders Gazette. The first meeting of that community had about 50 people in. When they had decoded the entire worm, about 20 years later, there were about 5,000 people. That team formed the basis for the team that decoded the human genome. So I would say this community, it seems to me, is about where that community was in about 1960, basically. But you're at the start of something which has enormous potential if you can do it in the right way. So this is what happened then to the Cambridge Laboratory for Molecular Biology. It became this huge, great thing at the center of a vast kind of industrial and academic enterprise. Here's the diagram. So this is a very bad line. You do not want to be on this line. This is the line going down. This is the line of decline. This is the line that says you've got no future. So this is a very bad line. You want to avoid this line. You want to be on this line. This is the line of growth, of hope. This is the Silicon Valley line. This is the line that gets you funding. This is you speak for the future. So a lot of our discussion about innovation is about these two lines, because you don't want to be on the red line, and you do want to be on the green line, and you want to switch, if you're on the red line, to the green line. And often it seems like this, that we're in a world where these kind of, the story of disruptive innovation is there are all these lumbering people on the red line who are useless and myopic, and there are all these fantastic people on the green line who are disruptive, and they should overtake the people on the red line. And of course, it's not as simple as that, because it's not just that they clash, but often when you're on this red line, which is what being in some parts of the public sector feels like, there is more innovation on this line than you think. There are a hell of a lot of people right at the top of that line who are on that sort of plateau bit, who are busily innovating away to try and save what they've got. And there are also people down at the bottom who are innovating to sustain their position, albeit in a smaller kind of way. Meanwhile, the green line, this growth line, it starts in a whole myriad of different places with lots of different little niches where people kind of start off. It's not a definitive starting point. And moreover, the growth of that line is very uncertain. Actually, it takes lots of twists and turns. It's very fragile. You're never quite sure where you are on it. So the story of disruptive innovation, here are these new people displacing these old people, is, I think, completely useless for lots of the public sector. It's a complete kind of fiction. It doesn't really help us. So what does help us, I think, is this sense that we are often trying to create new things at the bottom of this green line. We're trying to create new niches and grow them. Meanwhile, there are lots of people on the red line trying to do new things to save and improve current systems, and they kind of meet in the middle. And in this sort of middle, this sort of washing machine in the middle, you get lots of sort of interaction between all these people, and out of it, you get lots of hybrids. So there aren't just two possible futures, there are many possible futures and many possible solutions, and the whole solution space is much, much bigger than you might imagine. So as well as Google self-driving electric cars, you get Uber, you get Lyft, you get car sharing, you get GPS, you get hybrid cars, and you get cheaper, better, lower emission traditional cars. You get all that set of options. So where then, if this is more like a vision of the future, where you're getting this sort of production of hybrids the whole time, where would you start putting labs? Well, I think already today we've heard some people who are running labs which are here. They're in a traditional system and trying to improve it and save it because they're trying to improve the interface for customer services or deliver it in a better kind of way. They're definitely within traditional systems, but they're doing it in a kind of new kind of way. There are lots of people down here. I've spent my entire life down here. This is the kind of interesting but marginal space where you kind of do really interesting things, but you're pretty irrelevant. And that's a kind of, has its attractions, but it also has its frustrations. I think there are a lot of people in here. So I think a lot of people in this room will feel they're in this space. They're convening this space. It's confused. It's full of hybrids, oxymorons, mutants, mongrels, you name it. It feels quite uncomfortable. But when Nicholas was talking earlier about doing startups, design thinking, nudge, and trying to scale up, in a way, I thought he was talking about trying to do all of that together. Or when Jorge was talking about using data and digital services to improve traditional services, but using new technologies, he was describing something that was in that kind of space, it seems to me. And then when Nicholas said the key thing is about funding and scale, actually he was suggesting that labs should be here. And then one thing we haven't heard enough of and need to hear more of is labs that would sit here. Because these are labs which truly represent the future. And so one of the most interesting people in this space who Jenny Winhall has introduced me to and her thinking is a woman called Cheryl Dahl who runs a project in America called Future of Fish, which is trying to redesign entire supply chains, markets, consumption, habits, ecosystems around fishing. And Cheryl says her job is to be the client of the future system. So in our busyness to advise, help, solve, problem solve within current systems, or to grow even new sort of limited solutions, we mustn't forget this perspective that we might be the clients of the future system. And then you get this kind of measles effect. And actually, you could run a lab in virtually any of those spots. And I would guess there'll be people here who could locate themselves in different places in this diagram doing different things. And I think we should welcome all of it, basically. And the thing that I would really recommend is to not get theological about it. So I think that's the future. I think that actually this is can feel, I think, at times this world incredibly fragile, very difficult to make progress. But actually, the fact that there is this gathering, if you can make the most of what you share and really build a common culture and common knowledge and common approaches, actually you could start doing some very, very powerful things to link labs to movements to systems, to take them out of controlled and marginal environments into the real world and bring about real change. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, Marc Ventresca has now made it. I assume you didn't come on either the red or the green line because they're both shut down, today. But we've got a few minutes for you to respond. Do you want to do that from here or here?
I'll do it from here.
You're mic'd up, aren't you?
I'm mic'd up, I think, yeah. Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you very much, Charlie. Excellent and a really stimulating discussion, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I just want to take 2 minutes to basically reinforce the ideas that Charlie gave us and to say them in a slightly different way. The remit for this panel, in some sense, was to have a conversation about what's old about labs, what's been there for a long time, what can we learn from trying to understand something about, historically, the kind of early moments to convene, to converse, to do that in specialized and segmented ways. I want to start with a quote many of you will know that actually really, I think, engages the comments Charlie just made. That is a line from a guy named William Gibson. Some of you know he's a science fiction writer, author of Neuromancer, who apocryphally said, "The future's already here, it's just very unevenly distributed." And that, I think that notion captures the very interesting lines that Charlie just gave us. The futures are all around us, pieces of them exist. If you take that notion seriously, the future's already here, it's just very unevenly distributed, we do begin to really think about the early science laboratories, careful observation, complex communication, efforts to thread together insights from what were at that point very divergent traditions of observing and noticing. We also think a little bit about the idea of having specialized spaces, whether those are physical spaces, and I thought the pictures around the Cavendish labs were really powerful, from a small, relatively marginal space in a car park to a large industrial size factory of knowledge. So I think that idea of spaces, both physical, but also cultural spaces, spaces of both sameness and difference, are important. The other kind of quick comment I want to make about the future's already here, it's just very unevenly distributed. That's an injunction to all of us, I think, to be looking out for and to be paying attention to what are those available futures, what's around already. I think part of the work of the labs, as Charlie said, is to emphasize and focus and intensify insights that we have. Part of the work, though, is to thread together what are worlds that aren't currently connected. They're efforts to basically begin to imagine some of those pieces of the future that lay around and then to begin to push those ideas. I think the last part of that quote, "The future's already here, it's just very unevenly distributed," also reminds us, and again, Charlie said this, there are 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 other groups also imagining futures and also pushing those futures. And so implicit in this notion is some notion of contest, struggle, some learning, some failure. A lab in that sense becomes then a vehicle to push a set of ideas, both to test in the way that we've talked about, but also to push those ideas and at some point to give up those ideas and move to others. At the end of his talk, Charlie mentioned Cheryl Dahl at Future of Fish, who is, he said, is an amazing person. And in the spirit of the future's already here, it's just very unevenly distributed, she is trying to assemble a future by literally saying, I will be the client of that future system. I think those are the ideas that are very powerful. I want to encourage you to really think about what that means for your work. What are the future systems that are going to be able to enact and implement and make possible the visions that you have? A lot of my other work really has to do with what I call system building. It's the work of the people who actually thread together what are currently disconnected and distributed worlds and begin to bring those together both in conversation and in practice. And I think that's what this kind of a gathering does. Enormous heterogeneity of voice and view and perspective here, and we have a chance for a conversation now. So thank you. Yeah, that's good. Clapping is good. That's always good. So Charlie, do we want to go back and forth? Do we have 2 minutes? I'm not sure how we're going to move this at this point. What's your sense? Or questions or whatever?
Comments?
Yeah, please. Happy to have comments, questions. Please, yeah.
Yes, so,
Hey guys.
there you go. Right, so my name is Kristen Bas, and I run the Danish Design Center. So one of the intriguing things in this discussion about what we have currently and the future, and that Charlie also sort of hinted at, was this, that labs or these environments that we build, their purpose is to test theories, test alternative possibilities, solutions, and so forth. But what I think, and this is also where, in a sense, Charlie's introduction ended, is on the question of creating new theory, of creating new futures. So maybe not only assembling what we already have, but actually imagining visions of what is not there already. And I agree, it's always about some assemblage, it's also about some bricolage and so forth, right? But still, I would like to ask you about what about the role of, exactly about discovery, of creating and imagining new theory. For example, the small question of what is the state, or what might the state be in a contemporary society?
Well, I completely agree with that. I spent a long time working in an organization called Participle, which was founded on the idea of creating a new generation of welfare services. And we had a great time trying to do that. And it's very difficult to make money. It's very difficult to sustain yourself unless you're also keying into where the current system is in some sense as well. Or you have to find a way of modulating your relationship between the two. And the only other thing that I would say, which I think Marc mentioned, which is important, is that in all this talk about creativity and control, actually a lot of innovation is about challenge and conflict. And a lot of the problem with it is that it creates conflict. And we like to create this sense through design thinking, IDEO, go away and play with some toys, that it's all kind of going to be fantastic. But the reality is when it gets real, it generates conflict. And that's the problem. And so as well as focusing on design as creation, actually a lot of the biggest ideas come from people challenging. They will come not actually from labs, they'll come from social movements. And it's the way that labs connect with social movements that challenge the status quo, which is why then this problematic relationship, if you're in government, can you really connect with social movements outside government who want to challenge the status quo? That all becomes really quite important.
Farhan Hooke, Spark. Just a question on the maker movement. Okay, so you said it needs to be relating to a movement, and obviously the maker labs, the maker movement is the big movement. So that doesn't relate to government programs or public programs so much. Have you seen examples of how maker movement and public labs or public organizations have teamed up to make impact? Because innovation comes from the crowd in a way. But I see them still as separate things. And have you seen examples of them connecting and making more impact?
Well, I must say that I haven't, beyond very kind of nascent things in education, where I think there is a real connection and there's an alternative account of education that you can give through making, which is only just starting to have an impact on the education system. But I think one of the big debates in education in the future is what do you make when you go through education, not just what you learn. And the other is about cities, because I think making in cities is going to be a really big thing in future. And so then city governments like in New York or in London or wherever will have to attend to what the city will be like as a place to make, but also as a place to grow, actually. So it's coming. But what I wouldn't do is just create a government making lab. I would somehow try and find a way to locate where the energy is in some sense.
It's Martin Stewart Weeks from Sydney in Australia. So if I sort of ramble a bit, it's because I'm still half asleep, but it's okay. I want to make two quick comments because I think I'm hearing a couple of contradictions, and one of which I want to pick up from Christian, which is that it seems to me right now politics, certainly as I understand it, is about as inimical to this process as I've ever seen it in 30 years. Almost everything you've said, the kind of political systems in which we try to operate would be working almost directly and persistently, and I'm going to overdo this slightly, systematically to shut down everything you've just said. So I think it is good that you've raised the word politics, and we can't treat it glibly, because it strikes me that there's a huge sort of antithesis between the thesis, between the story you've just told. And the second thing it strikes me, which is another contradiction, is that, you know, innovators need to get used to the fact that you start in a hut in a car park. So stop asking for the big building in Cavendish. Just get on with it and stop moaning, because it is a residual edge business, and that's the game. If you don't want to be in that game, then perhaps go and do something else.
Charlie, 1 minute response. Sorry.
Well, I definitely believe in starting things in margins and being comfortable with that. But I also think that connecting with resources, systems, larger groups, that is the big missing connection. And having been involved in countless programs where we failed to make that connection as powerfully as we want. But the final thing is that we shouldn't think of the state as a monolithic thing, or as politics as a monolithic thing. Actually, what's happening to states and politics is they're becoming more like patchworks everywhere. They're becoming more like patchworks. And one of the most important bits of the patchwork is cities. Because actually this story is absolutely true in cities. And there are cities all over the world trying to do this. So my recommendation would be to find the right kinds of places in any political system where there is a kind of opening up going on, or a breaking down going on, or a new energy emerging, where you can get that working.
That's great. Regrettably, we're going to end the session today, but thank you very much. Thank you to Jeff for getting us going, to Charlie for comments, and to all of you. I think the questions around politics are going to pervade the day. I just echo what Charlie said. I think we want to avoid seeing politics little or big P only, and seeing the state as a monolith. The last point Charlie made, I think, is one I want to end on, which is simply beginning to appreciate the wide heterogeneity here, and to thread together lots of different kinds of relationships is actually the source of a lot of creative innovation. So thank you very much. Yep.